Africans are always stealing things, and this is a problem for the rest of the diaspora. Let's talk about this for a second. So, in a different world where this app was not potentially vanishing in a few days, I would have liked to have a much longer conversation on this because it's a fairly complicated topic, but it be like that sometimes. So, in this world, I'm going to speed run this fairly nuanced discussion in this video. I have learned many things in the time I've spent on this app, especially whenever I talk about Africa. I get a lot of very interesting responses. There are some that are just completely irredeemable that I can't exactly repeat here, but there are some that seem to be legitimate critiques from the rest of the Black diaspora about how we talk about African problems. And the one I'm talking about today is this idea that Africans, that is continental Africans, people from the continent, have a tendency of stealing things from the rest of the diaspora. And by things, I basically mean history and culture. So it's this thing that happens where somebody from the continent claims that everything is from Africa. And so African Americans are really African, people from Haiti are really African, and so everything that Haitians and African Americans do, for example, are fundamentally African. And so people from the continent kind of lay claim to the cultures and the histories of these people in different parts of the world. I got one comment on one of my videos that suggests that continental Africans basically have very little to be proud of, and so that is why we constantly seek to steal things from other people in the Black diaspora who have achieved more than we have. Now, in general, the diaspora wars are very interesting. There are many parts of the diaspora wars that are really just kind of vibes, just kind of games, just kind of jokes, not that important. But then there are things like this, which seem to be legitimate critiques about how we approach things like history and culture. And I would like to introduce some important considerations to this conversation. So I first started noticing this trend when I posted this video, and in this video I talk about jazz. One of my claims in that video was that jazz is African American music. Jazz is music that originated out of the United States from Black musicians. I was trying to illustrate a few points with that video, and one of them was this idea that really with any diaspora, ideas flow back and forth fairly frequently. And because of that, we all owe each other a lot. I said that jazz is African American music, but jazz has its roots in Africa. And that was one of the claims that I received a decent amount of pushback on, because people said that there was no jazz in Africa. There are no jazz instruments in Africa. You do not find jazz harmonies in traditional African music. And some people saw this as another case of a continental African trying to claim something that does not belong to them. Jazz is American music, so why am I suggesting that it has roots in Africa? That seems like continental Africans trying to lay claim to something that does not belong to them. And I found this entire conversation very strange because it is true there was no jazz in traditional Africa. As I said, jazz is African American music. It is a creation of the New World. Yet jazz has its roots in West Africa, and that is not really a controversial thing to say. This does not mean that continental Africans invented jazz. This does not mean that continental Africans own jazz. This does not mean that African Americans owe anything to continental Africans regarding jazz. This is simply a fact of how history played out. And just as we cannot talk about the history of jazz without talking about West Africa, we also cannot talk about the history of jazz without talking about European classical music, because that is where a large part of jazz harmonies come from. And so jazz is a combination of many different things, but it was put together by the genius of Black Americans in America. That is essentially the story of jazz. But jazz comes from many places. In order for jazz to have emerged where it emerged, how it emerged, many other things need to have been happening historically and in the background. And I think it's very important and necessary and very interesting to pay attention to a lot of these connections, because it removes any sense of arrogance that anyone might have regarding their claim to a specific idea or cultural practice. For example, one of my other claims in that jazz video was the idea that Afro beats, which is basically contemporary pop African music today, owes a lot to African American music, because Afro beats comes from Afrobeat, which is the music of Fela Kuti, and Fela was highly influenced by African American genres of music when he was creating his style. And so this is a very interesting example of how something that is culturally significant to people on the continent was really given to them in part by those in the New World, by those in the United States. The point here is to illustrate that there's a lot of back and forth that happens within a diaspora. We owe each other a lot. We have all gotten a lot of things from one another. And so any sense of superiority coming from anywhere is in many ways very ridiculous, because in many cases, a lot of the cultural practices that we hold so dear were influenced by something else at some point in time. And so we can certainly give praise to whatever specific people group creates a particular piece of culture. For example, jazz and African Americans. We can give praise for that, but that shouldn't take away from the conversation that is seeing how a lot of things had to connect before jazz could be even conceptualized by anybody. Another example of how this conversation manifests itself popped up in this video where I talk about Hegel and Haiti. Now, to give a quick recap on my thoughts regarding this video, Hegel claimed that Africans, black people, do not have history, do not understand their place in the world, do not understand freedom, stuff like that. And so I pointed out the fact that the existence of Haiti and what happened during the Haitian Revolution proved Hegel unbelievably wrong, and it's something interesting to think about. Now, in response to that video, some people wondered why, if Hegel had beef with Africa, why am I using Haiti to prove him wrong? After all, Haiti is not in Africa. And Haitian history is not African history, so even if there was a revolution in Haiti, that has nothing to do with what Hegel was talking about with Africa. Now, this is wrong, partly because Hegel's claim was specifically about black people, most of whom naturally live in Africa, and so his claims about black people referred to all black people, so Haiti would not have been possible in his framework in either case. And some people wondered in a video about African history why I did not talk about other African empires like Mali or Timbuktu, but instead I talked about Haiti to prove Hegel wrong. And that's a fair point, but it's important to keep in mind that that is not a video on African history. That's a video on Hegel. And I talk about Haiti because Haiti was something that happened in his time right under his nose, and I could almost excuse Hegel for not knowing about some of these other empires, but there's almost no way he did not know what happened in Haiti. But back to the actual point here, the fundamental question here is Haitian history African history? And in the most straightforward sense of the question, obviously the answer is no, Africa is Africa and Haiti is Haiti. But as we can all probably see, there's more complexity to this question. I got a comment from somebody saying that Haitian history is Haitian history. It happened on Haitian soil, not on African soil. And that's a good point. That's a true point. But it's important to keep in mind that history is not made by soil. History is made by people. And I think that in our analyses of history across the diasporas, we would do better to focus on people than we would to focus on soil. So who are people X? Where did they come from? Where did they end up? What took them from point A to point B? What did they bring with them as they traveled across wherever they traveled across to get to the New World? Where did Haitians come from? What did they bring with them? How did any of those things that they brought with them affect how they lived when they found themselves in the New World? These conversations flesh out the connections between us all and are more interesting than focusing on the soil. And there's a proper way to have this conversation where we acknowledge that what happened in Haiti during the revolution was the result of the efforts of Haitians and nobody else. But Haitians did not come from nowhere. How did they end up there? What did they bring with them? These questions are interesting and important as well. I think there's a lot of benefit, not only culturally, but also intellectually, in focusing on a lot of these connections to see how much we truly owe to one another. And there's a way to have these conversations about broader connections without taking away from the efforts of those on the ground who are actually doing things, without taking away from the genius of Black American musicians, without taking away from the bravery and the genius of Haitian soldiers during the revolution. We can have these conversations about broader themes without separating them from these other smaller contexts. Now, I understand the desire, especially in the Black diaspora, to hold on to your culture and your history as yours and only yours, because so much history has been destroyed and has been distorted over the years. And so I understand that there is a pull naturally to be very protective of one's history and one's culture. But these connections exist whether we want to acknowledge them or not. None of these things have happened in a vacuum. And it would be good for us to start paying attention to them because it unearths a lot of very interesting pieces of history that are, if nothing else, at least good to know. I'll leave you with just one. In the 1930s, Italy was about to invade Ethiopia. And in protest of this, over 200 Black Americans in Harlem at the time signed up to go and fight the war on behalf of the Ethiopians against the Italians, because they wanted to protect this African country which had so much cultural significance in the imagination. Now, most of these people were not actually able to go and fight because the US does not allow you to fight in foreign wars. The only exceptions were a few fighter pilots who helped the Ethiopian Air Force. Their story is a very interesting one for some other time. But I say all this to say that the things that connect us will always be more important, and in many ways are always more interesting.
It's always that you are African until it's time for you to be African. We are always from the motherland until for you it's time to be from the motherland. We are African people, yeah. Until it's time for you to be an African person. Then is when you try to let us know that actually I'm African American. And then we don't care about the significance, because the significance doesn't matter. It's always trying to prove who is superior to the other person.